I'd like to move on to the next speaker, who is Tommaso Venturini. He is an associate professor and research coordinator at the Sciences Po Media Lab and working on research and teaching of digital methods, controversy mapping, social modernization. He's going to introduce us to mapping, complexity, and how to visualize a world of change. Tommaso, please.
Thank you very much. This is going to be a little bit of a change in comparison to the earlier presentation. I know about nothing about infectious disease and how they transmit. I'm an expert in another discipline that is called controversy mapping that we'll talk to you about, that we have used with Frank Bert and some of his people on his team to understand the recent spread of Ebola, and in particular the spillover of this disease. It's a little bit of a stretch, I have to say, of the methods we have developed, but the results are pretty interesting, and I will show some of them this morning, but you can see others in the posters that are shown right above our head, next to the room Scorpio, I think. So, controversy mapping has been introduced as a teaching method first by Bruno Latour, whom some of you may know. He's a very renowned scholar in the STS, Science and Technology Studies. And he introduced this method some 20 years ago to train his students in the observation and description of the socio-technical debate. The method has spread now as a pedagogical method, and it's taught in many universities, not only in Paris, where I actually leading the course, but also in Copenhagen, Milan, Manchester, Amsterdam, etc., etc. But since a few years, and then here you have, if you're interested at the address controverse.sciencespo.fr, you have an archive of the best controversy atlas produced by our students. So these are students' work, but some of them are really, really good, and some of them are on epidemiology and medical science in general. But controversy mapping is also a research method. In the last few years, there have been quite a few projects that we have submitted and so carried out to translate this teaching method into a full research method. Here you have a list of the most important of those methods, of those projects, sorry. And the reason why we study controversy is that they help us, and I will be very quickly on this because we don't have much time, is that they help us to open what we call the black box of science and technology. So when you meet something like a spacecraft, like a space shuttle that you see in an example, but it's the same thing it would be for a disease, or the same thing would be for any technological or natural piece of science and technology, it will look as a confined and simple object from the outside. But that is only because you see it from the outside. And the inside is extremely complicated. It's made of many different interconnections and many different elements that connect, sometimes in ways that are difficult to anticipate, creating a complex and emergent network. And here you have, for example, the shuttle, that is the Columbia shuttle after the explosion, where you can see all the different pieces. And it's precisely in the moment when things goes wrong, when they explode, when controversy explode on science and technology, that we are able to open up the black boxes of science and technology and look inside and see at these complicated interconnection that not only connects science and technological objects with their components, but they also connect them to the rest of society. And by the way, as you might know, the result of the investigation about the explosion of the shuttle was that the failure was connected to a very tiny little piece of plastic, a ring of plastic in the shuttle, but also at an organizational failure at the NASA. So again, we have this internal, external network of connection that we have to take into consideration. But controversy mapping, besides being a method of teaching science and technology, and besides being a method of studying, researching on science and technology is also a method to encourage public participation with science and technology, engagement of public opinion with science and technology. And this is a little quotation from the first research project on controversy mapping that I quoted before, called MACOSPOL, and it says the MACOSPOL consortium has been assembled to address this question: how to explore the practical tools to represent in new ways scientific and technological controversies, so as to equip the potential public and turn it into a real representative arena. So the idea is to not only equip researchers with tools that they can use to deploy, unravel the complexity of science and technology, for example, of epidemics of disease, but also help the public, a larger public, to understand those complex connections. And the reason is, and I will very briefly quote a very important journalist, Walter Lippmann, that you may know of. The reason is that at the end of the day, it is the public opinion that will have to decide on these controversies. As Lippmann says in his book, The Phantom Public, it is controversies of this kind, the hardest controversy to disentangle, that the public is called in to judge, where the facts are the most obscure, where the precedents are lacking, where novelty and confusion pervade everything. The public, in all its unfitness, is compelled to make its most important decision. So the key phrase here is in all its unfitness. So Lippmann is a pragmatic thinker. He knows very well that the public just do not have the time and the resources to become expert of all the technological and scientific controversy that is asked to judge. He only has very little time to look at the evidence present, and he has to take a decision on the basis of this little evidence. So it is very important, and that is, according to Lippmann, the role of journalists and media in general, to provide the public with the cues, with the hints that allows it to decide quickly, but fairly enough, on scientific and technological controversy. And that is also the objective of controversy mapping. But as you might have noticed, there's a slight contradiction between the two objectives that I mentioned for controversy mapping. So as a teaching and research method, controversy mapping is meant to help researchers to observe controversy in all their richness. So to be as close as possible at the complexity and richness of the controversy. But as a participation method, it's called to provide the public with legible description. So easier way to look at the issues at stake. So how can we keep together these two contradictory objectives? And by the way, you might remark that this contradiction concerns controversy mapping, but more generally concerns mapping in general, also geographical mapping. And here, very quickly, you have example of two maps of the city of Paris, which are both useless, but for opposite reason. Right? One is too complicated. You have the name of all the streets, and you have 3D monuments, which makes the map completely impossible to use. And the second one is too poor. Right? It's very legible, but you don't have enough information to navigate through the city of Paris. So how do we keep this thing together? Let me skip this one. So how do we keep complexity and simplicity together? And I think that the answer is by renouncing to the idea of finding a good balance, a good point of equilibrium between the two, which does not exist, but on the contrary, find ways to move from one to the other. And I will propose, in the second part of my intervention, 3 possible movements that I will illustrate with the work that we have done with EFSA through this continuum of complexity and simplicity. So the first movement is what we call controversy atlases. The objective of controversy mapping and the objective of debate mapping in general is not to produce one map that would enclose all the richness of the issue at stake, which is impossible, but to produce an atlas, that is to say a series of maps. Each of them concentrating, focusing, showing different aspects of the phenomenon at stake. So I will propose you 5 different questions that we can ask on controversies in a specific order, but this order can change, of course. And if you look at the work that we've done with EFSA, for example, we use different orders. So the first question that we can ask is, what is going on? And this question allows us to move from statement to debate, to understand that in controversies, statements, so position taken by actors, are never isolated. They're always the answer, the reply to the statement made by someone else. In the case of Ebola, for example, what we did was to connect 20 different scientific articles that were discussing about the spillovers of Ebola from non-humans to humans, and sort of compare how the different positions that they take on this spillover, how they reply one to another. So this would be just the count, the simple count, and for a higher resolution version of all the images that I will show, I can just point at the posters that are showcased upstairs. So this would be just the counting of the different possible factors and how they work as cause and effects of the Ebola epidemics and its spillover. But it's more interesting when we go from this to that. So when we build a network that shows how, according to the different papers, these factors are connected in a complex network. And by the way, it's not by chance. I think almost all, if not all, the presentation that have preceded me showed network which were visualized using a software Gephi that we developed at the SciencePo Media Lab precisely for controversy mapping. Second question we can ask is who? So who is talking about the controversy? Because it's not enough to link the different statements one to another in a controversy. It's also very important to ask, to reconnect those statements to the persons that, or to the agency, or to the institution that has spoken them. So in the case of the Ebola research, we were very careful of always keeping the link between the factors and the factor connections and the papers, the scientific papers, in which this connection were established or put forward. The third question is how. So here again we move from actors to network. We don't only see how statements are connecting to the different actors, but also on how different actors are connecting one another, which are the alliances or oppositions that exist between scientists, scientific institution, policy maker, policy institution, etc., etc. So then here, for example, you have even a more complex network in which you see the network of the factors, the network of the articles, the papers in which they were connected, and the references, the connection, the citations between those papers. The fourth question that we can ask is, where does this connection take place? And this is even more complicated because this where can be considered in a geographical way, as we did in this map, in which we tried to reconnect the different factors to the different parts of the world that were mentioned, because as it was said in the first presentation today, it is very important to understand the different parts of the world. Of course, different phenomena may happen, so and different connection may be more or less important according to which particular settings you're looking at. But sometimes this where is not just geographical, right? It can also depend on, for example, different social context, which can happen differently in different parts of the world. So the lines of fractures that we have to follow are sometimes different from the geographical one. They can be economic, they can be societal, they can be connected to the law, they can be connected to many different things. The last, but not least, map that we should always include in our atlases is a map of the time, to show how controversy changed through time. Controversy and debate in general are the most dynamic part of social life. And it's very important to show how the alliances change through times, and how what we think is, for example, a factual connection between two factors may in fact change as new information comes in. And here, for example, we plotted on a timeline the different papers concerning the Ebola spillovers, showing how they change, how their presence in the scientific literature has evolved through times with different peaks in different years. So that was the first movement, going from one map of a controversy to many maps and an atlas of a controversy. But there's a second and a third movement that I would like to mention very briefly, because I don't think I have much time left. 5 minutes, that's perfect. The second movement is what we call datascape navigation. And it's about giving the reader of our controversy atlas the possibility to trace back the work that we did in producing them. So scientific papers in general, scientific research, tend to go in that direction, from complex to simple, right? You start from collecting a lot of complex data, then you, through the analysis, you simplify, you extract some simpler findings from this data, and then you go to the result presentation that can be done through visual diagrams or just through text, in a way that you would simplify for your readers the findings that you haven't found. But we think that is also very important, especially in controversial situations, to give the readers of scientific literature the possibility to explore back, so to go in the other direction, to understand the interpretation of the result, to have a clear explanation of the methods that have been used so that they can check their solidity, and also to have direct access to the data, and if possible to the raw data that have been used. This is much more important today as scientific research becomes more and more digital and relies more and more, for example, on computer software, right? It is very important that the people that use our results are, can, for example, access to the code of the software that we've been used. And for example, just to give you an example, the network software that I mentioned before, Gephi, is released under an open source license, not only because other people can then improve on it, reuse it and improve on it, but also because then it's possible for any of you to look into it and, for example, know exactly how nodes are positioned in the space, how clusters emerge, how color or partitions are colored in the software, etc., etc. The third movement has to do with changing the sort of classic expected protocol that we have in scientific research. And this is an example of a couple of projects that we did on controversy mapping that I quoted before in maps and media. And in both, when we wrote the Gantt of the project at the beginning, when we submitted the project to the European Union, we were imagining a very sort of classic and linear protocol of research that would go from data collection that would have been done by domain expert, then the analysis done by the data expert, then the representation done by design expert, and then the dissemination to the public. But in both cases, in both these projects, we very quickly understood that this kind of linear protocol would not work. That we needed to, in particular, engage the potential users of our results from the very beginning of the project. So alpha users should be part of the research project from the very beginning. Otherwise, the results that we will produce will not be relevant for them. And when we worked with Frank and with EFSA on Ebola, we were very clear that we wanted them to be part of the discussion with us from the very beginning so that we could exchange and iterate throughout the whole process, which is even more important because this still linear protocol should in fact be twisted in a sort of spiral in which we go again and again towards the alpha users of our results, and we ask them what is relevant, how we can improve the result, how we can redo them again. At the beginning, you always have bad maps, and you always ask bad questions to your alpha users. But little, by exchanging with them, with iterating on the result, you can obtain better and better results. And for this, it's important that we use some sort of agile methods that allows us not just to produce results at the end of the cartographic campaign, but to produce intermediary results that we can check with our users. So for that, we sort of invented this this research method that we call Sprint, that is some way borrowed from the hackathons of the open source development and the bar camps of digital humanities, where we would invite expert developers, designers, and data crunchers to work together for 1 week in an intensive way on a bench of maps, so that we can meet physically together and develop together and exchange very quickly about what are the important aspects of the phenomena that we're studying and how we can represent them. So that's basically it. If you want more information, there's a couple of articles that you can read, or you can go on my website. I forgot to put on the URLs, but it's tommasoventurini.it, and you'll find all the references about this controversy mapping work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. It's a very interesting presentation on a methodology that I think most of us are very unfamiliar with, but which seems very promising in tackling a problem where you have very little information in the beginning, but you need to assimilate it quickly with a large group of people. So I think it can be very helpful for this problem of emerging pests and diseases in animals and plants.